Chapter 11. The little clearing Will had christened Healer's Clearing was growing considerably more crowded. Malcolm's small cottage was already stretched by having to accommodate Lord Ormond and Xander. As a consequence, Will and Horace chose to pitch their own one-man tents on one side of the clearing, close together where they could talk in private. The Skandians had brought canvas and ropes from their ship, and they set about building a large communal shelter for themselves on the far side. At least, Will thought, there was no lack of timber available in Grimsdale Wood. A large fire pit was constructed in the middle of the clearing for heating and cooking purposes, and to provide an area for relaxation as well. On the first evening, Horace looked a little askance at the roaring blaze that the Skandians built. The Northmen seemed to have a love for setting big fires, whether they were burning down villages or just sitting around having a drink. "It's a big fire," he said doubtfully to Will. "It could be visible for miles." The ranger shrugged. "No harm in it," he replied. "It'll just add to the legend of Grimsdale. Strange lights, strange sounds." At that moment, the Skandians, who had brought a few kegs of akavit, the rough grain spirit that they flavoured with caraway seeds, broke out into a sea shanty. "Strange sounds indeed," Malcolm put in. "If I could have come up with something like that, I would have kept people away from my home for another 10 years. One of the Skandians broke away from the circle around the fire and lurched towards the small group of onlookers. He thrust a beaker full of the spirit into Horace's hands. "There you go, General," he said. "Take a drink." Horace sipped carefully. He made an immense effort to control his expression, but there was nothing he could do about the way his hair wanted to stand on end. When he could breathe again, he handed the beaker back to the man. "Not bad," he said, a little breathlessly. The Skandian bellowed with laughter and slapped his new commander on the back. The sea wolf's grasp of military courtesy was rudimentary, Will thought. "That's the spirit," the Skandian said, and staggered back to join his friends. "My God," said Horace, the taste of the liquor still burning his mouth. "I could take rust off my armour with that stuff." Xander had come out onto the veranda of the cottage as the singing had started. He glared disdainfully at the Skandians and walked over to join the little group. "Is this going to continue for very long?" he asked of no one in particular. Malcolm, Horace, and Will regarded him with distaste. Then, deciding that he had asked no one in particular, they each decided to let that person answer. Xander's scowl deepened as he realized they were ignoring him. "Malcolm," he said, "how is my lord supposed to sleep through this infernal racket?" Malcolm regarded him thoughtfully. "In my experience," he said, "if one is tired enough, one can sleep through a little noise." "A little noise?" the secretary spluttered. "Do you call what those barbarians are doing?" He got no further. Will's hand suddenly clamped over his mouth, and the rest of his question was reduced to unintelligible mumbling. Eventually he stopped, peering fearfully above the hand into the ranger's eyes. Will's eyes, usually so warm and cheerful, were suddenly cold and threatening. It was as if a curtain had been pulled aside to reveal a previously unseen side of the ranger's character. "Xander," Will said, when he was sure he had the man's full attention. "Since we have been here, you have done nothing but moan and complain. Malcolm has saved your lord's life. He has given you shelter and food and a safe place to stay. These Skandians, the barbarians to whom you refer, are friends of mine. They are going to help you regain your castle. Some of them will probably die doing it. Sure, we're paying them, but the fact remains we need them. Now, we are all sick and tired of you, Xander. You'd better realize that, unlike the Skandians, we do not need you. So if I hear one more word of complaint, one more snide remark, I swear I will drag you back to Macindaw and hand you over to Keren. Is that clear? Xander's eyes still bulged above Will's hand. The ranger shook him roughly. Is that clear? He said, very slowly and distinctly. Then he took the hand away. Xander breathed in, deeply and raggedly, his chest heaving. After a pause, he replied in a small voice, Yes. Will took a deep breath in his turn and exhaled slowly. Good, he said, and Horace and Mallkallam both nodded agreement. Will started to turn away from Xander, but the little man could not resist trying to have the last word. All the same, he began in that pompous tone they knew so well. Will threw his hands to heaven in a gesture of despair, then swung back on the little man. Right, he said angrily. His hand shot out and grabbed a handful of Xander's collar, twisting it so that the secretary was thrown off balance and turned slightly side on. Then Will started towards the forest trail that led to the Black Mere and, eventually, out of Grimsdale Wood to the plain beside Macindaw. I'll be back in an hour or so, he called over his shoulder to Horace and Mallkallam. I've got some garbage to take out. Neither of them moved to stop him. Xander squirmed and wailed, but Will's grip was like iron. He held the secretary off balance and continued to walk quickly away, keeping him that way. Xander could do nothing but totter precariously along in his wake. He sensed that if he stumbled and fell, Will would not stop, but would simply drag him until he regained his feet. Horace wondered later if Will would have made good on his threat. He thought that perhaps he might have, except that Xander would have been able to provide Keren with a lot of useful information, including the whereabouts of Mallkallam's clearing, and the fact that Will now had a force of armed and eager Skandians at his disposal, and was planning to attack the castle with them. Most likely, Horace thought, his friend would have thrown Xander into the mere. Whether he would have fished him out again was a moot point. But it was one they would have to wonder about, because just as Will reached the beginning of the track through the woods, one of Mallkallam's people dashed into the clearing, coming from the other direction. It was Poldarek, a young man whose spine had been badly twisted in a childhood accident. He was permanently stooped to one side and could not look straight ahead, as his head was set crookedly on his shoulders. Yet Horace noted how quickly the young man could move among the trees. Amazing how the body could adapt, he thought. Poldarek saw Will now and sidled up to him so he could look up at the young ranger. Your friend, he said. She's signalling. 2 hours later, Mallkallam's small living room was crowded with people. Horace, Mallkallam, Ormond, Gundar, and Xander were grouped around the fireplace. Will finished deciphering the last few words of Alice's message and sat back, frowning. Bad news? Horace prompted. His friend shrugged. Could be. Apparently Keren is expecting a visit from a General McHaddish in the next few days. He glanced at the faces round the table. Does that name mean anything to anyone? Gundar shrugged, as did Mallkallam. Ormond frowned thoughtfully. then shook his head. Other than he's obviously a Scotti, and the son of someone called Haddish, no. Have you heard the name, Xander? The little man thought carefully and shook his head. After his recent confrontation with Will, he was grateful to be included in the discussion and wished he could provide more information. I'm afraid not, my lord. Well, said Horace, practical as ever, at least it confirms your theory that Keren's in league with the Scotti. True, Will said, but I wish I knew a little more. For example, it'd be nice to know if this McHaddish is bringing an army with him. Ormond rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. I shouldn't think he'd be bringing a large party at this stage, he said, and they all turned to him. The main route through the border will be almost impassable at this time of year. The snows won't melt for at least another 3 weeks. He reached for Will's pen and a spare sheet of the paper he'd been using, and drew a quick sketch of the surrounding countryside. The mountains here form the natural border, he said. As you can see, Castle Macindaw lies right across the road from the main pass into Araluen, but the pass is closed during the winter by snow. That's why we never needed a large winter garrison at Macindaw. We've never had to contend with more than small raids. He quickly drew a series of thin slashes through the mountains on his chart. There are a lot of small side roads, but they're steep and tricky. You might get a small party through one of them, but not an army with its baggage train. Horace had leaned over his shoulder to study the chart. He nodded thoughtfully. In addition, Horace said, no general would move a large force into hostile territory without initial reconnaissance. Will nodded agreement. So, we can assume McHaddish will have a small party with him, which means they'll probably travel by night. He glanced around and saw the others nodding, except Gundar, who was looking totally disinterested by now. Skandians hated planning, Will remembered. So, what did you have in mind? Horace asked. We keep watch on the castle so we know when he arrives, Will said. Then, when he's heading back to Picta, we take him prisoner and ask him a few questions. Horace nodded agreement. Not bad, he said, but don't expect to get too much out of a Scotti. From what I've heard about them, you'll never get one to talk. Now it was Malcolm's turn to smile. Oh, I think I might know a way, he said.